Hey there, my friend. If you study seriously, if you take notes, and if you find yourself rereading those notes again and again, this video is for you. And before anything else, let me say this clearly. There is nothing stupid about that habit. Rereading feels like this responsible thing to do. It's what school train us to do. It's what most advice quietly encourage. But rereading your notes is one of the least effective way to actually remember or understand what you learned. Not because you are doing something wrong, but no one ever explain what rereading your notes does to your brain and what it doesn't do. In this video, I will explain why rereading feels helpful but usually it's not that helpful and what to do instead if you actually want your learning to stick. For most learners, the loops look like this. You study something, you take notes, and when it's time to review, you go back to read them. Maybe once, maybe multiple times, sometimes highlight again, sometimes slowly, carefully, line by line, because it's feel like what learning is supposed to look like. You are not guessing, you are not skipping steps, you are doing what seems safe and sensible. Rereading become the default not because it's the best option but because it's the most obvious one. And yet over time something start to feel off. You reread your notes, they look familiar, they make sense while you are looking at them, but a few days later or a week later or when you actually need the idea, it's suddenly hard to bring it back on your own. Not completely gone, just slippery. And that's the frustrating part. Because you did the work, you spent the time. So it's not hard to wonder why am I forgetting this? Why I can't recall this? I have been in that exact place. I remember sitting with my notes before exam, rereading them carefully, feeling like everything I got it. I generally felt prepared and then later, sometimes much later when I try to explain the same idea without looking, there was this gap. Like I know I have studied this. Why does it feel harder than it should? That gap does something over time. It doesn't just make studying harder, it start to mess with how you see yourself as a learner. You begin to question your memory, your intelligence, your method. You might not say it out loud, but that thought show up eventually. Maybe I'm just bad at retaining things, and that's the real cost, not efficiency but self-doubt, because when efforts doesn't turn into clarity it seems to assume the problem is you. So this video isn't about pushing you try to do hard, it's not about giving you another technique to maintain, it's about explaining why rereading feels the right thing to do and why it keep letting you down anyway. Once that makes sense, the frustration start to lift. Not because you have been adding something new, but because you have stopped blaming yourself for a problem that never was about effort. To understand what's really going on, we have to look at something subtle. Not why rereading fails, but why it feels like it should work. Because once you see that illusion clearly, everything else falls into places. The problem with rereading is not that it doesn't do anything, it's that it creates the wrong signal. When you reread your notes, your brain gets a strong sense of familiarity. You recognize the words, you recognize the structure, you recognize the flow, and recognition feels lot like understanding. That feeling is convincing, especially if you care about learning. But what you are experiencing there is not knowledge getting stronger, it's familiarity getting louder. Familiarity is about recognition. You see a sentence and you think, yeah, I have seen this before. Understanding is different. Understanding means you could explain the idea without looking. You could say it in your own words. You could use it somewhere else. The problem is that your brain doesn't clearly separate those two feelings. When something feels familiar, your brain often treats it as it understood, and rereading amplify familiarity without testing understanding at all. Because recognition is easy, it feels reassuring. You are not struggling, you are not stuck, nothing feels unclear. So your confidence quietly goes up. You think, okay, this makes sense. I remember this, I have got this covered. But the confidence has not been tested. It comes from the seeing the answer, not from generating it. And the more smoothly you reread, the more confident you feel, even though nothing new has been actually built. Here is a simple test you have probably experienced. You are reading a paragraph in your notes. Every sentence looks familiar. You nod along as you read. Nothing feels confusing, but then you close the page and you try to explain idea out loud as if you were teaching it to someone else. Suddenly it's not that clear. You know the words, you remember the phrasing, but forming the idea in your own words takes more effort than it expected. That gap is the difference between recognition and understanding. So here is the fundamental idea to hold on to. Rereading feels productive because it's familiar, not because it works. Familiarity creates comfort, comfort creates confidence, but confidence without reconstruction doesn't turn into usable memory. That's just the illusion. The problem is that familiarity is fragile. It feels strong while you are looking at notes, but it doesn't hold up when the page gone. And when the familiarity fades, there is often nothing underneath it to support recall or explanation. That's why rereading collapses at the moment you actually need the idea. Friends, to understand why that happens, we need to look at what rereading doesn't force your brain to do. When you reread your notes, your brain is smoothly following along. The answers are already there, the structure is already laid out, nothing need to build from scratch. Your eyes move across the page, but your thinking doesn't have to push very hard. There is no real resistance, no uncertainty, no moment where you have to stop and ask, do I actually know this? Rereading keeps your mind comfortable, and comfort is the problem. For learning to actually get strength, your brain need to do something very different. It need to search, it need to rebuild, it need to make a small connection on its own. Not perfectly, just enough to feel a little resistance. That moment where you pause, where you are not sure, where you have to think for a second, that's not a failure, that's the work. Memory getting strength when your brain has to work a little instead of being carried by what's already written. Friends, rereading remove friction because the answers are visible, the path is already marked. You never have to risk being wrong. On the other hand, real learning moments feel different. You hesitate, you try to recall something and miss a detail. You notice a gap and have to fill in it. The effort is uncomfortable, which is exactly why it works. Rereading keeps everything smooth. Learning happens when things get a little rough. This is why rereading works right up until the moment it matters. As long as the notes are in front of you, everything feels clear. But when the context change in exam, a conversation, a problem you need to solve, that support disappear. And suddenly the idea has to stand on its own. That's when familiarity collapse because rereading train recognition, not reconstruction. It prepare you to recognize the idea, not to produce it when the page is gone. So here is the failure stated clearly. Rereading doesn't create knowledge that can stand on its own. It keeps ideas alive while you are looking at them. The moment they not disappear, so does the support that made everything feel clear. That's why rereading feels helpful during review but unreliable during recall. It never prepares the idea to survive without the page. Friends, once you seize this, the solution start to look different. It's not about reviewing more often, it's not about being strict with yourself. The problem never was forgetting, it was how the idea was handled before forgetting ever become an issue. To fix that, we need a new system. We need to change how we interact with notes in the first place. Alright, this is where most advice goes. You hear that rereading doesn't work, and the next step is to add something new. A new method, a new tool, a more structured review routine. The assumption is that the problem is missing technique. So the focus shift immediately to managing notes better, organizing them better, or reviewing them strategically. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. That kind of advice feels helpful because it's give you something concrete to do. A system create a sense of control, a method create a certainty, a routine create the feeling of progress. When learning feels shaky, structure is comforting. It makes you feel like if you just follow the steps carefully enough, the result will eventually show up. So it's understandable why people keep reaching for new method because they promise relief. But here's the hidden mistake is where the focus goes. Most advice try to fix how notes are managed, how they are organized, how they are scheduled, how they are reviewed, but they skip something more basic. They skip how notes are actually used at the moment of learning. So you end up optimizing the container while leaving the interaction unchanged. And if the interaction stay passive, no amount of structure around it can create understanding. So just to be clear, this isn't going to turn into a system. I'm not going to give you a workflow to follow, a schedule to maintain, or a setup you have to copy. Not because those things are useless, but because they only work after something more basic is in place. If how you approach a note is stay the same, no system on top of it will fix that. That's why this video is staying simple on purpose. So friends, here is the cleaner way to look at it. You don't have a note problem and you don't have a memory problem either, but you have a note usage problem. Your notes were not falling because they were bad or incomplete. They were failing you because they were being used as something to consume, not something to think with. That's the difference change everything. Once you see the problem this way, the solution is stop being complicated. It's not about fixing your entire system. It's not about reviewing more aggressively. It's about changing one small thing, how you approach a note when you come back to it. That the shift is simple, but it changed the role notes play completely. And once that role change, everything else start to make sense more. Before I show you what to do instead, I want to lower the bar on purpose. This is not a technique you need to master, it's not a habit you need to track, it's not a something you need to do perfectly. You are not adding a new system on top of that what you already have. You are just changing what you expect a note to do for you when you come back to it. That's it. If this feels almost too simple, that's a good sign. So here is the change. Use your notes as cushion, not page to read. That's the whole idea. Instead of opening a note, going through it line by line, you open it with expectations. It should challenge your understanding. And when you try to do this, your notes stop being something you consume and start being something that asks something back from you. Real quick, let me explain why this work. A question change what your brain has to do. When you read a page, the thinking is already done for you. But when you face a question, your brain has to search. It has to reconstruct the idea. It has to notice what's missing. If the answer is incomplete, the effort matters. It creates just enough resistance to turn recognition into understanding. A question forces your brain to participate. A page let it stay passive. So here is what this look like in practice. When I open a note, I ask myself, what was this about again? Why did this matter enough to write down? Sometimes I can answer right away, sometimes I can't. And the moment of not knowing, that slightly hesitation is exactly the point. I'm not testing myself, feel smart. I'm giving my brain to reason to reach before I show up the answer. Only after that I look at the note. So the note itself doesn't need to be complex. It can be very simple, a clear title, a short explanation in your words, and one question. That question is what you face first, not the content underneath it. I don't open this note to read it carefully. I open it to check where my understanding is. If I can answer the question, that confirms it. If I can't, the note helps me rebuild it. That's the role the note play. Friends, using notes this way change what success feel like. Success is not remembering everything immediately. It isn't opening a note and feeling confident the whole way through. Success looks more subtle. It feels like noticing gaps sooner. It looks like ideas coming back a little faster each time. It looks like needing the notes less instead of more. If this feels harder than reading, that's not a sign it's failing. That difficulty is the signal the real learning is happening. At this point, a common fear usually show up. This feels slower. I feel less confident than when I rereading. That reaction makes sense. Rereading give you the feeling that everything was under control. But this way takes the comfort away. But what it replaces it with is something more reliable. Instead of confidence that fade away, you are building understanding that hold up when the notes are gone. Friends, once you start using notes this way, something deeper begin to shift. Notes stop being something you go back to consume. They become something you use to think against. And when that happens, the question isn't how do I review better. It become what kind of learner I am trying to be. That's where this really start to matter. Friends, when you zoom out and look at everything, a different pictures emerge. Forgetting was never the real problem and rereading was never the real solution. The deeper issue was simpler than that. Most notes are written to support review, not understanding. They are designed to be looked at again, not to change how the idea shape in your mind. And once you seize that, a lot of past frustration start to make sense. So it helps to say this simply. Notes are not memory storage, they are thinking space. They don't store learning the way hard drives store files. What they do instead is support the process that allow understanding to form. When that process happen, memory show up later as a byproduct, not something you have to force. That's the role notes meant to play. This is why notes fail so often, even when they are detailed and well organized. Copying feels productive, rereading feels responsible, but neither of those change how ideas are structured in your thinking. They preserve information but they don't integrate it. And if a note doesn't change how you think, it can't change what you remember. That's not a discipline problem, it's a design problem. At this point, there is a strong urge to do more, to recognize everything, to add a new scheduled system, to build a bigger system around your notes. That instinct is understandable, but more structure won't fix shallow encoding. If the note didn't change how you engage with the idea when you first wrote or revisit it, no amount of management afterward will. The shift has to happen upstream in how notes are written and approached, not in how they are controlled. Friends, everything we have talked about here comes before tools, systems, or techniques. Those things can help surely, but only after this shift is in place. Without it, tools just help you reread more efficiently. With it, tools start to amplify thinking. Once notes are written and used for integration, structure begin to make sense on its own. That foundation is what everything else build on. Now if you want to take a step further, watch this next video in which I'm talking about a one note that you should write from every book, video or article you read and how it can improve learning with less effort. You can also find the links in the description. Well, that's all I wanted to say for this video. Hope I see you in the next one. See you there.